Just minutes after my divorce was finalized, I called my father. "Dad," I said, "it's time to tell them the truth." There was a long silence before he answered. "Are you sure? Once this comes out, nothing in their family will ever be the same." "They made that choice," I whispered. I ended the call before I could change my mind. When I looked up from my phone, my ex-husband was standing across the courthouse steps laughing with his parents and two of his brothers. To anyone walking past, they probably looked relieved that a difficult chapter was finally over. They thought they had won. What they didn't know was that the divorce had never been the ending I feared. It was the beginning they never saw coming. 6 years earlier, if someone had told me my marriage would end on those courthouse steps, I would have laughed. I met Daniel at a charity fundraiser outside Columbus, Ohio. He was confident without being arrogant, funny without trying too hard, and he had a way of making every person in the room feel like they mattered. At least, that was the version of him everyone else saw, including me. I came from a family that valued privacy. My father had spent decades helping build and invest in regional manufacturing, logistics, and commercial construction companies. He never liked attention. He always said that if people talked more about your name than your work, you were doing something wrong. Because of that, most people had no idea how connected he really was. Daniel knew my father was successful. He just assumed he was another wealthy businessman. He never bothered asking questions. Looking back, that probably mattered more than I realized. The first year of our marriage felt almost ordinary. We bought a modest house, argued over paint colors, burned dinner together, stayed up too late watching terrible television. When I think about that time now, I don't believe every smile was fake. I think Daniel loved the life we were building. I just don't think he loved me enough to protect it. The changes happened so gradually that I kept finding excuses for them. His mother suddenly had opinions about everything. Apparently, I folded towels wrong, hosted holidays wrong, spent money wrong. Even the way I spoke became something to criticize. Daniel never defended me. He would squeeze my hand under the table afterward and whisper, "Just ignore her. She's always been like this." Those words became routine. Just ignore her. Just ignore my brother. Just ignore Dad. Just ignore it. Little by little, I became the one expected to keep the peace. One Thanksgiving, his father raised a glass and thanked everyone for supporting the real backbone of the family. Then he looked directly at Daniel. "My son's built everything we've got." I smiled politely. I had spent months helping Daniel reorganize his consulting business, reviewing contracts, fixing accounting errors, and redesigning his client proposals. Nobody mentioned it. Later that night, Daniel apologized. "They don't mean anything by it." I asked him a simple question. "Do you ever notice that I'm always the one expected to understand everyone else?" He didn't answer. He kissed my forehead instead. At the time, I mistook silence for kindness. It wasn't. It was convenience. My younger sister noticed the change before I did. "You're quieter," she told me one afternoon over coffee. "No, I'm just tired." "You apologize before you say almost everything." I laughed. She didn't. "That's not who you used to be." Her words stayed with me longer than I admitted. Around our 4th anniversary, Daniel started insisting we keep our finances simpler. He wanted fewer conversations, less transparency. He handled more of the paperwork. I trusted him. Why wouldn't I? He was my husband. Whenever I asked questions, he had an answer ready. "You worry too much. It's already handled." "You're overthinking." Those phrases slowly replaced real conversations. Meanwhile, his family became increasingly confident around me. Not warmer, more confident. As though they'd already decided exactly where I belonged. Mostly quiet. Mostly agreeable. Mostly invisible. One evening his oldest brother joked, "You're lucky you married into this family." Everyone laughed. I smiled because I didn't know what else to do. My father, who happened to be visiting that weekend, watched the exchange without saying anything. On the drive home, he asked only one question. "Are you happy?" "Yes." I answered too quickly. He glanced at me, but didn't argue. My father had a habit of respecting answers even when he didn't believe them. Months later, he invited Daniel and me to dinner. Toward the end of the meal, he casually mentioned corporate ethics, governance, and why reputations matter more than quarterly profits. Daniel nodded through the conversation. Afterward, he called it the longest business lecture I've ever survived. I laughed with him. I didn't realize Dad had been watching him more carefully than I had. The real cracks appeared after Daniel's consulting firm began struggling. Clients left. Projects stalled. Money became tighter. Instead of discussing it honestly, his family closed ranks. Conversation stopped whenever I entered rooms. Plans were made without me. Important decisions somehow became family matters. One afternoon I walked into my in-laws' kitchen just as everyone fell silent. Daniel's mother smiled far too brightly. "We were just talking." "About what?" "Oh, nothing important." I remember driving home feeling ridiculous. Why did it bother me so much? Families had private conversations, didn't they? Still, it kept happening. At birthdays, cookouts, Sunday dinners. Always the same awkward silence. Always the same forced smiles. When I mentioned it to Daniel, he sighed. "You're imagining divisions that aren't there." Maybe the first was. I desperately wanted to believe that. Then came the first lie I could actually prove. Daniel told me he was spending 2 days in Cincinnati meeting a new client. The next morning, purely by coincidence, I bumped into someone who asked how our weekend trip to Cleveland had gone. I stared at them. "What trip?" They looked confused. "I saw Daniel yesterday." When I confronted him, he admitted he'd changed plans at the last minute. "You would have worried." "So you lied?" I simplified. That answer settled somewhere deep inside me. People don't usually replace honesty with word games, unless they've become comfortable doing it. I wish I could say I left then. I didn't. I believed marriage meant working through hard seasons. Counseling, communication, patience. I tried all of it. Daniel attended exactly 3 counseling sessions before deciding the therapist was biased. According to him, everyone expected too much from him. Eventually, even our counselor gently asked whether accountability seemed unfair only when it belonged to him. He never went back. The final year of our marriage felt less like a partnership and more like a negotiation. Every disagreement somehow became my responsibility to fix. Every compromise came from my side. Every apology came from mine too. Then something happened that changed everything. My father invited me to lunch. Just me. No Daniel. He looked unusually serious. "I want to ask you something, and I need you to answer as my daughter, not as someone's wife." I nodded. "Has anyone ever pressured you to sign documents you didn't fully understand?" My stomach tightened. "What kind of documents?" "Any documents." I remembered several investment acknowledgments, partnership disclosures, and authorization forms Daniel had assured me were routine. Dad didn't accuse anyone. He simply asked me to gather copies, if I still had them. That conversation haunted me for weeks. Not because of what he said, because of what he didn't. For the first time, I wondered whether my father knew something I didn't. And if he did, how long had he known? That question stayed with me all the way to the morning I walked into the courthouse, believing I was losing everything. I had no idea my father was carrying a truth that would force all of us to question everything we thought we knew about my marriage. For the first few days after the divorce, I couldn't stop thinking about that conversation over lunch. He hadn't told me what he knew. He hadn't tried to influence my decisions. He had simply asked whether I'd signed documents I didn't fully understand. At the time, I'd assumed he was being an overprotective father. Now I wasn't so sure. The morning after our phone call, I drove to my parents' house. Dad was already in his home office when I arrived. He wasn't sitting behind his desk. He was standing by the window with a thick folder in his hands. When he turned around, he looked older than he had the week before. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "For what?" "For waiting." I frowned. "You knew something." "I suspected something." "What's the difference?" "The difference is evidence." He motioned for me to sit down. I wasn't willing to accuse your husband of anything based on instinct. My chest tightened. What did you find? He slid the folder toward me. I didn't investigate your marriage. I reviewed business records after one of my compliance officers noticed unusual patterns involving several companies we work with. I looked at him, confused. What does that have to do with Daniel? More than either of us realized. Inside the folder were organizational charts, emails, vendor contracts, and pages filled with notes. None of it looked dramatic. None of it looked like the kind of thing that destroyed families. Then he pointed to a page listing several consulting firms. Daniel's company was one of them. So look at the dates. I did. Several contracts had been approved unusually quickly. Others had bypassed ordinary review procedures. There were no crimes, Dad said, before I could jump to conclusions. But there were conflicts that should have been disclosed. I looked up. Conflicts? Family members recommending relatives for contracts. He paused. Friendships that weren't reported. Professional relationships presented as independent when they weren't. I stared at him. Daniel never told me any of this. I know. My father leaned back. Neither did his family. Over the next hour, the picture slowly became clearer. Daniel's family had spent years helping one another professionally. There wasn't anything inherently wrong with that. Families help each other all the time. The problem was transparency. Recommendations had been presented as objective. Relationships had gone undisclosed. People reviewing proposals hadn't always known who was connected to whom. Again, none of that automatically meant anyone had broken the law, but it created questions. Questions that responsible companies were obligated to examine. Dad looked exhausted. I hoped your marriage had nothing to do with any of this. It did? He sighed. I think they expected your connection to our family to strengthen Daniel's reputation. I felt my stomach sink. And when it didn't? They became frustrated. I remembered years of comments. You should talk to your father. Maybe your dad could introduce us. Your family knows everyone. At the time, I'd brushed them off. Now they sounded different. Much different. I never asked Dad for favors. I know. You never wanted me to. I know. He gave me a sad smile. And that's one of the reasons I'm proud of you. A week later, my attorney called. Several companies had begun routine internal compliance reviews after questions surfaced during ordinary contract audits. Daniel's consulting firm wasn't the only business involved. Multiple organizations were reviewing procedures. No accusations, no dramatic raids. Just professionals making sure policies had been followed correctly. Word spread quickly, not because anyone leaked confidential information, because businesses talk. Projects paused. Outside auditors were hired. Meetings multiplied. Suddenly, the confidence I'd seen on my former in-laws' faces outside the courthouse disappeared. Daniel called for the first time since the divorce. I need to talk to you. We've talked. Not like this. There isn't another version. His voice sounded tired. My family thinks your father started this. My father didn't start compliance reviews. You know what I mean. No, I answered calmly. I know exactly what I mean. Silence. Then he asked the question I'd been waiting for. Did you know? I didn't. You believe I married you because of your family. I don't know why you married me anymore. That answer hurt both of us. I could hear it. Weeks passed. The reviews continued. Some contracts were rewritten. Some partnerships ended voluntarily. Several companies introduced stricter disclosure requirements. Training programs were updated. Independent oversight increased. Life moved on. It wasn't the dramatic collapse people imagine in revenge stories. It was slower than that. More realistic. More uncomfortable. One afternoon, Daniel asked if we could meet. Against my attorney's advice, I agreed. Not because I wanted reconciliation, because I wanted answers. We met at the same coffee shop where we'd once planned our wedding. He looked thinner. Older. I loved you, he said. I think part of you did. He looked down. I never meant for my family to treat you the way they did. But you let them. I kept telling myself I'd fix it later. You kept asking me to wait. He nodded. I know. You watched me become quieter. He didn't argue. You watched me apologize for things that weren't my fault. Nothing. You knew they expected me to use my father's name. I told them no. But never loudly enough. That finally made him cry. Not dramatic sobs, just quiet tears from someone who had run out of excuses. I failed you. Yes. I don't expect forgiveness. I know. He took a deep breath. I also need you to know something. I waited. I never asked anyone to hide those professional relationships. But you benefited from them. Yes. And when you realized how complicated everything had become. I froze. That sounded painfully believable. Not heroic, not evil, just weak. Sometimes weakness causes as much damage as cruelty. Before we left, he said one last thing. My parents still think your father destroyed us. What do you think? He looked out the window. I think the truth caught up with us. That sentence stayed with me. Months later, several reviews concluded. Some organizations required additional disclosures. Some consulting agreements weren't renewed. Some people stepped away from leadership roles voluntarily while policies were strengthened. No one outcome fixed everything. But accountability had happened. Legitimately. Professionally. Without anyone pulling secret strings. One evening I found myself visiting my parents again. Dad was planting flowers in the backyard. I owe you an apology, I told him. He looked surprised. For what? I thought you wanted to control my life. He smiled sadly. I wanted to protect your ability to choose it. I didn't understand. You weren't supposed to. We sat together until the sun started disappearing behind the trees. I almost told you everything before the wedding, he admitted. Why didn't you? Because I didn't have proof. And because you knew I'd think you hated Daniel. He nodded. I've spent my whole career telling people facts matter more than assumptions. He looked at me. I couldn't abandon that principle because it involved my daughter. That might have been the hardest lesson of all. Love doesn't become stronger by ignoring the truth. It becomes stronger by respecting it. 6 months after the divorce, I bought a small townhouse. Nothing extravagant. Just mine. I painted every wall the color I wanted. I adopted a rescue dog. I accepted a position with a nonprofit organization that specialized in ethical governance and organizational transparency. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years I'd believed strength meant enduring everything quietly. Now I understood that strength sometimes meant asking uncomfortable questions before signing your name. Daniel sent one final email almost a year later. It wasn't an apology. He'd already given me that. It simply said, I hope you found peace. I thought about replying. Instead, I archived it. Not because I hated him. Because I no longer needed the conversation. The biggest surprise wasn't discovering who Daniel had become. It was rediscovering who I had always been underneath everyone else's expectations. People still ask whether I regret the divorce. I regret the years I spent believing that keeping the peace required giving away pieces of myself. I regret mistaking silence for love. But I don't regret finally choosing honesty over comfort. My father never used his influence to punish anyone. He simply refused to let the truth stay hidden once the facts were clear. The consequences belonged to the choices people had already made. Looking back now, I realize the phone call outside the courthouse was never about revenge. It was about finally allowing the truth to speak louder than the stories everyone else had been telling me. And that was the first day my life truly became my own.